I'm very delighted and thrilled to introduce the next provocation, Peter Gelb, who is the Maria Minetti Schrem General Manager of the Metropolitan Opera. And Peter will be in conversation. We're doing a bit of a different format. Peter will be in conversation with Eugene Downs, the Cultural Diplomacy Chief for the Irish Government. Please join me in welcoming Peter and Eugene.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome, Peter. So we have a conversation with one of the great impresarios of our time. Many of you in the house are running venues or festivals, arts organizations worldwide, which are meeting big challenges, whether that was COVID, other huge asymmetric shocks, economic shocks, societal shocks, and the challenges you have to bring your organizations through and make them find new models which are resilient, the theme of this Congress, which are sustainable. You could say that those challenges are magnified when you're running the largest performing arts organization in America, probably the world.
Probably the most expensive one.
Touché, touché. But we're just as we start, and by the way, we'll be going out for comments and questions later on. We're in the New York Times building, of course, the new New York Times building by Renzo Piano. But Peter, that's kind of all in the family. You've of course close New York Times connection through your father.
Well, when I was growing up in New York on the Upper West Side, my father, who he was a lifetime New York Times journalist. And he actually began working at the Times during World War II as a copy boy, where he met my mother, who was a replacement copy girl. When I was a child, he was then working as a cultural writer and critic, and he would bring me to the Times on weekends. And my older brother and I would fly paper airplanes in the city room. And I got to experience what a newspaper was like back then, which was very different than it is today. I mean, back then, newspapers were published using lead type that was formatted into these cases that would go into the printing presses, and the idea of a instant, non-stopping news cycle was in no one's imagination back then.
So art has very much been in your family. So your father, Arthur, one of the legendary theatre critics, and managing editor of the New York Times. Your mother, Barbara, the niece of Jascha Heifetz. Heifetz, your granduncle.
My great uncle, yeah.
And both of them, the great biographers of Eugene O'Neill, great Irish-American playwright. So you grew up in this wonderful literary, artistic, musical house. So the new Metropolitan Opera is 60 years old this year, and in its opening season, you were there. I mean, you have a 60-year association, rather unusual, with the institution you're running. You were out there just as a young boy in the opening season with your parents. As a teenager, nearly 60 years ago, you were working as an usher in the house. 40 years ago, or nearly, when you were with Columbia Artists, the then general manager brought you on board as kind of part-time director of radio, director of television operations. And then 20 years after that, which is now 20 years ago, Peter was appointed general manager. So you have this extraordinary half-century plus knowledge of the organization and its challenges and its opportunities. So when you took over 20 years ago, I mean, you made some huge changes early on, and maybe we can talk about those and then look at what are the current challenges. I mean, one of your biggest changes, I guess, was around new opera, new work, renewing the art form. Do you want to tell us a little? I mean, this was risky, wasn't it?
Well, when I came to the Met, when I was interviewed by the search committee of the Met, at the time I was running the classical record label internationally for Sony Music, and although I had dreamed about someday actually having the job that I currently have, not realizing that it would be partly a nightmare. But I had no immediate idea that I would actually be offered this job. When the search committee, it was Beverly Sills, the great singer who turned artistic administrator and who was the chairman of the board of the Met at the time I was approached. And she called me and asked me if I would come in to be interviewed. At that point, they'd interviewed all of the, I guess, leading suspects or candidates who were running other opera companies. And even though I had never run an opera company, but because I had an association producing and working all my life, working with artists and producing events and making films and managing concerts and tours and things, I had a lot of experience. They asked me, the search committee asked me what I would do if I was to run the Met, and I told them I would change it, or try to change it, because I felt that it had become isolated from the broader public, and that its future really depended upon reconnecting it to the broader world and the broader world of the arts. So basically, I was hired on the basis that I would be changing it. And of course, as anyone who has started in an institution knows, making change is always easiest at the beginning, particularly if you're being hired to change things. So there was a one-year transition period during which I prepared to become the 16th general manager. Actually, the Met, when you said the 60-year new Met, it's actually the Met dates back to 1883. The 60 years is the time when it moved. The last 60 years has been in residence at Lincoln Center, which is where it moved to from its old address on 39th Street and 7th Avenue. But during this one-year transition, I prepared to make a lot of changes. And because I was new, I was able to navigate these changes not only with the board of the Met, but also with the unions. The Met has 15 unions, and we sometimes get along. But at the beginning, as one of the chief stagehands said to me, he said, "We're going to give you a break and agree to some of the things I wanted to do," which included not only changing the programming to make it more theatrically oriented and bringing in more new works and new directors. A lot of directors and designers had been afraid of ever working at the Met. They felt it was an environment that was hostile to their art, their creativity. So I spent that first year, sort of on a charm offensive, traveling around the world, trying to convince a lot of the leading theater directors and opera directors that the Met would be a friendly environment under my watch. And also planning some very significant changes in how the Met would communicate with the public, including this idea, which we launched in my very first season, of transmitting the Met live into movie theaters on a global basis, which many people thought would never work, but actually was very successful. And it has been copied as well by other institutions. Mm-hmm. But just the whole idea of making the Met more of a public institution, having opening night piped into Times Square, creating a student, we already had a student program, but a rush ticket program that would make tickets available for opera newcomers, $25, a program that we still have to this day. It's expanding the Met in every way we could possibly think of that would connect it more with the broader public.
And maybe we'll come back to Met Live in HD, because again, that's been such a huge program. What has been, over the 20 years, the most difficult change?
The most difficult change? I don't think any of the changes have been particularly difficult. The most difficult challenge has been the economic challenge, because the Met has no government funding. Of course, these days that's probably a good thing, because if we had any government funding, I'm sure it would have been removed months ago. But relying, so there are many advantages to relying on the private sector to support the Met, but the greatest difficulty has been the shift in wealth in this country. So the 20 or 30 years ago, the richest Americans who were philanthropists supported the arts in a way that the richest Americans today do not. Triple-digit billionaires don't even know what opera is, with maybe one or two exceptions. So it's been, the challenge has been how, in the Met, the difference between the performing arts companies like the Metropolitan Opera and smaller organizations, I mean, the Met is so much bigger, say, than the New York Philharmonic, which is just because it has so many more people doing it. Opera, as those of you who know opera know that it requires a huge workforce. So, we have, on a typical day at the Met, we have anywhere between 3,000 to 4,000 people working there. And whereas a symphony orchestra might have a couple of hundred people there. Yeah. So the challenge of financing that is extraordinary. And when the wealthiest Americans who supported the arts did what they did, that was sufficient to make ends meet. But what I started saying before was that when the Met was formed in the late 1800s, and the Philharmonic and the other cultural institutions in this country, they were formed on the basis of commercial viability, not philanthropy. So unlike museums and educational institutions that were created with endowments, the Met never had an endowment. And by the time it realized it needed an endowment, it was too late, because it was struggling to just make ends meet because of the widening gap between the costs and the earned revenue. So it was actually the reason why the Met became a media power, and it was really a result of a fundraising gambit, because in coming out of the Depression in the late 20s, early 30s, the Met decided, it was the longest running general manager of the Met, Giulio Gatti Casazza, in his final years, who decided, running the Met, who decided that the Met should be on the radio. And it was basically a gambit to create a national fundraising vehicle for the Met, so that the Met would become America's national company. And that was how the Met's famous radio broadcasts, which continue to this day and now include not just America and Canada, but the rest of the world, began. But it was, and it's fascinating, actually, if you look back in the history of radio, the reason why the Met radio Saturday matinees existed was it really was an extension of the American college football season, because college football games, which today, of course, go into January with bowl games, but back in the 30s, the college football season ended in early December, and the same radio stations across the United States that carried college football shifted to the opera, and that was how the Met Radio Network began.
So in a way, the innovation you were bringing with Met Live in HD is part of this century-old engagement by the Metropolitan Opera.
In a way, I was inspired by the Met radio broadcast to extend it using modern technology. The fact that cinemas were just at that moment when I took over, the cinemas were all transferring from film projectors to digital projectors. So it became possible to actually have this radio experience turned into a multimedia experience in movie theaters.
And the Met Live in HD has, well, pre-COVID, shall we say, again, just looking at the sustainability piece, was actually a very significant net contributor to your bottom line then. It was what about $15 million or so net?
Actually, before the pandemic, it contributed about $18 to $19 million a year in net profits after covering all the incremental costs of the cameras and the residual payments and media salaries and fees to all the various union members. And that was also one of the things when I said that the stagehand said that they would give me a break. It was because at that time there was no real. The Met had been in the 80s, as you mentioned, I was running the Met's media department, the radio and television. In fact, I made the deal with the European Broadcasting Union to extend the Met radio programs into Europe. But by the time I was appointed general manager, the Met's presence on public television had ended because its main sponsor, Texaco, had stopped sponsoring the Met. And the radio broadcasts were still continuing, but there was nothing beyond that. So the unions were interested in my plan, which was to take the salaries they were receiving for their Saturday matinee radio broadcast and turn that into a media salary that would be against revenue sharing, that would enable us to, for the first time in the history of the Met, exercise any kind of platform that was available to drive our content. So and that included the live transmissions at cinemas, which became a big success, and the format that we created of not only showing all the action live from the stage, but also taking the audience backstage during intermissions and scene changes with our cameras, sort of revealed the inner workings of the Met in a way that was very compelling for the audiences in the cinemas. So, yeah, that was somewhat of it was transformative in terms of, from a marketing point of view, from an artistic point of view. It at a time when the major record labels were in decline. And no longer, selling hundreds of thousands of opera recordings. Suddenly, the Met emerged as a vehicle for opera singers. The biggest stars knew that being in a live Met transmission would mean that we would be delivering them to the kind of audience that they used to reach through recordings over a period of months. We would deliver it in one Saturday afternoon. So it was the average attendance prior to the pandemic for a Met cinema transmission was anywhere between 200 and 400,000 people in attendance. And we still to this day have audiences as far flung as inside the Arctic Circle. There's a faithful Met Opera audience in Tromsø, Norway, who watches us. They were watching last Saturday when we transmitted I Puritani. And they'll be watching the next time we transmit our next opera. But we have, because it's a 1 o'clock in the afternoon start time, at the Met, we are able to serve multiple time zones live. So a live matinee from the Met is being seen live in Vienna, is being seen live in Berlin, and on the Champs-Élysées, everywhere. It used to even be live in Russia, but of course no longer.
Which we'll come back to.
Right.
Actually, can we just...
Not because the Russians don't want it, because we don't want them. But.
And can I ask how? I mean, I'm imagining, how many people here have been at a Met Live in HD broadcast? I'm guessing about, 70, 80%. So that left a gap because you're still rebuilding audience. It had about halved post-pandemic, so it's no longer...
It's about 60%. The problem is that during the pandemic, because of the emergence of the streaming services, the entire adult movie theater audience was halved, basically, and that included our audience. So we are now back to about 65% of where we were.
And that's left a significant net income gap.
Well, it still provides it's still net income positive, but very little compared to what it was.
And then, Peter, one of your other major departures, I mean, for the decades before you took over, the Met had produced a handful of new operas, or commissioned, and Ghosts of Versailles by Corigliano and so on, but less than most big companies. And then in the 20 years you've been here, you've accelerated this. You have, more than a dozen, 15, 20 commissions, mixture of world premieres, and then commissions where it suits you. Because, again, you would think in a financial crisis, many organizations obviously have retrenched and have reduced programming or been more conservative. It feels like you've gone in the opposite direction in increasing your bet on new opera, on contemporary work.
Right. Well, I feel that, I mean, it may be counterintuitive, but I think that the only way that opera as an art form can survive, let alone thrive, is through bringing in new audiences. And the only way to bring in new audiences is to present exciting presentations, whether they're a classic Zeffirelli production of La Bohème, which we continue to present, or Anthony Minghela's magnificent production of Madame Butterfly, which is playing at the Met right now, which was my very first opening night in 2006, or brand new interpretations of classics, like the one that Yuval Sharon is going to be directing in early March of Tristan and Isolde with Lisa Davidson, the great generational Wagnerian soprano, to either commissioning or curating new work. So for me, it doesn't matter whether it's a work that we are responsible for the creation of. In fact, it's a lot more work. We're also very happy to take a work that somebody else has workshopped and brought to success on the stage. For example, Huang Ro, I think, who's here in the audience today. I had heard about, we had already commissioned Huang Ro to write a new opera based on Ang Lee's The Wedding Banquet, which is unusual to have a new opera that's a comedy, and which Huang Ro is working hard on. But I had heard about the great success of The Monkey King in San Francisco, so I flew out and caught the last performance and immediately decided that we would bring it to the Met. So we're doing that. So I have no pride of authorship or pride of production. If we see something good, we'll take it. It really doesn't matter but we also feel that there's a need. There are so many composers now in this country, brilliant composers who actually are doing what was unthinkable in classical music for most composers 30 or 40 years ago, which is actually trying to write operas that the public will like. That we are, solidly behind them, and we feel that they are definitely a path forward for our art form. Because no art form can survive if it stops doing new work. It's just not possible. We're not, opera should not be an antiquities museum.
Mm-hmm. And it's striking that many of the new works that you've commissioned or co-commissioned, I know you established a real creative partnership with Andre Bishop at Lincoln Center Theatre in terms of the whole development process, involve artists of color, creators of color, also operas in Spanish, again, which would not, of course, have been a part of the core repertory. So you've kind of doubled down on that bet at a time when you're facing really serious structural financial challenges.
Well, I think the pandemic and the social kind of revolution that was going on around that time spurred me to realizing that we had to do much more than we had been doing. Mm-hmm. And it sort of liberated us in a way to expand our thinking and our artistic horizons. When we came back from the pandemic, the very first opera we did was Terence Blanchard's Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which we did not develop. It was developed by St. Louis, but Terence refined it and reworked it for the Met. And then we also did his work Champion. This season we have Gabrielle Elena Frank's new opera, El Ultimo Sueño de Frida y Diego, and which is about the surreal take on it takes place on the Day of the Dead in Mexico, and Frida Kahlo, who is already dead, goes back to haunt her partner Diego Rivera, for whom she has very mixed feelings. But she reluctantly, on the Day of the Dead, which is by superstition is the one day of the year when dead people go back to haunt their living relatives, she finds him kind of a broken, sick man, and in kind of a reverse twist on the Orpheus legend, she guides him back to the underworld with her, where they die happily ever after. But
that's a good tagline, maybe. For that.
So but that's it's a very compelling and beautiful work.
And in terms of your strategy for not just renewing the art form and also building again a sustainable financial model, but finding the new audiences of the future. That, I mean, I think over your 20 years, the average age of kind of single ticket buyers has actually gone from about like 64 years old to 44.
Yes, I mean, that's partly a result of our older audience having died. But it is also a result of our efforts to get younger people into the house. So you could say it's a joint effort.
So we've been talking around, as you say. You've made some big moves, programmatic moves, operational moves to find a new sustainable business model, financial stability, resilience. Your turnover is like $330, $340 million per annum in terms of operating overall costs.
Overall, it's about 330. Yeah.
And so the last several years, obviously, when public domain, you took a difficult decision to draw from the endowment 30, 40, 50 million per annum just to cover that deficit, structural deficit. And this is where we maybe pivot into the other big play you've been making to find new sources of income, is international cultural exchange and cultural diplomacy, and actually finding programs that can be artistically interesting and develop the art form, but also bring very, very significant net revenue to plug that gap.
Well, purely from a financial perspective, it's because of the because we have to raise so much more money than we did before the pandemic. We earned about 50% of our costs. Now we're earning through ticket sales and movie theater ticket sales, and concessions and things like that. Now we have to raise about 2/3 of our costs, and which is an impossible. We know it's not possible to do that, and that's why we've been pulling money out of the endowment, which is not a sustainable path forward, obviously, because our endowment isn't that big, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. If we had an endowment in the billions of dollars, we wouldn't have this problem, because we could draw a reasonable 5% rate from that, and that would be able to cover our costs. But the problem is, because we don't have that, and because the wealth in America is not going towards the arts in the way it once did, we are forced to. We've been buying time, basically, with these draws from the endowment as we try to figure out how we're going to be economically sustainable forward. And that is why we're doing many things right now, some of which I can talk about, without undermining our artistic mission of moving the art form forward with great new work, thinking of other ways to create revenue for the Met that will supplement the fundraising and will result in our having a future for the Met. So part of that was in looking at the world, the Met, because the Met has. We're one of the few artistic institutions that really does have a global following. We have, because of our live and HD performances, because of our radio broadcasts, we have an enormous global audience, and we're trying to figure out how to take advantage of that. Because of my personal background, I've worked in cultural exchange all my life, all my professional life. I felt it was very important to try to pursue cultural exchange agreements that might actually work as for the benefit of cultural exchange in general. I've worked in cultural exchange projects with Russia, with China, going back to the late 70s, when I was the assistant manager of the Boston Symphony and organized the first the tour of China for the Boston Symphony that was to celebrate the normalization of relations that was signed in a treaty that was signed by Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter, and up through the 80s and 90s, and right up until the invasion of Ukraine. I was working on many cultural exchange projects with the Soviet Union and then Russia, which ended with the invasion. And we could talk about that if you like. But for me, cultural exchange has always been a way of enhancing human understanding and creating, artistic matches that make the world a better place. So having operated in that way, I also thought that I could perhaps kill two birds with one stone and create a cultural exchange agreement with Saudi Arabia that would also be financially very beneficial to the Met. And that's one of the projects that we announced not so long ago, that we're still waiting for the deal to close, but the details of it are all worked out. It's basically an agreement that, which we publicly announced, that would involve one of the larger developments in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, which is the redevelopment or the development of the historical area, district of Riyadh, which is the capital, of course, of Saudi Arabia, where they're building a new opera house called the Royal Diriyah Opera House, and the agreement, the basic understanding of the agreement is that the Met would become, during our mid-season February break, when we are not performing in the Opera House in New York, that we would be the resident winter company of this new opera house when it opens in 28 or 29. And at the same time, recognizing the fact that the Saudis are making a great concerted effort to improve the lives of the people who live there with cultural enrichment programs and educational programs, that we would provide, help them with that infrastructure. Which is not to say that, obviously Saudi Arabia is a country of contradictions. Obviously there are still many repressive laws there, but you could say that certainly about Russia up until the start of the invasion. You could say that about the United States, unfortunately, right now as well. But so I believe in cultural exchange. I don't believe in cultural exchange with Russia, because Russia is trying to annihilate an entire civilization next door, which I think is beyond. I think cultural exchange can't help that.
And in terms of the Saudi deal, I guess you would have anticipated, a degree of public pushback, given also things like, of course, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and so on. Was it a difficult decision?
No, it wasn't a difficult decision, because for the reasons I mentioned, I really do believe in cultural exchange. And I think that the amount of good that we can do in helping, if this program really gets off the ground, the amount of good that we can do in providing positive cultural influence is a positive.
Okay. And I know obviously I believe the kind of accurate figures, there are public domain figures for the overall value of the deal, 100 million plus. I know you're not positioned to confirm or deny, but that's not necessarily accurate. But clearly it's the scale of the net income is such that it would be transformative to the fortunes of the Met.
It would be partially transformative.
Partially transformative. So you're open to.
We have other ideas too. But I would like to talk about Russia for a moment.
I was going to say, because we have a lot to talk about Russia-Ukraine. With time, will we just talk about Russia and Ukraine rather than run that video?
Yeah, we don't
okay,
need to run the
video.
Great. We had an excellent video, but you're not going to see it.
But Russia and Ukraine. So, as you say, for someone who had decades of experience and partnership with Russia, and an extraordinary musical culture in Russia, and a big co-production partnership with Bolshoi, right up until the full-scale invasion in February 22. That's a big decision to make. Obviously, Ukraine is very personal for you in the family with your wife, Carrie Lynn, Canadian-Ukrainian.
And I've recently discovered that I'm half Ukrainian.
Are you?
Well, according to the Ukrainians.
Okay.
My father's parents came from the same village, Veliki Komyata, which is in the Transcarpathian Mountains, which is now part of Ukraine. In fact, when his parents left, it was part of the Czech Republic. Mm-hmm. So
is that near Lviv, just in western?
It's about an hour and a half drive from Lviv.
Okay.
Near Uzhhorod.
And Uzhhorod, that's right on the Slovakian border.
Right.
So, you were making big decisions here because And interestingly, I mean, you've put the Met into a very strong position, which is somewhat of an outlier in terms of the major opera houses of the world, in terms of engaging Russian artists.
Well, not initially. I think most of the major opera houses thought we were doing the right thing, and we're doing similar things. There was a great outpouring of cultural support for Ukraine, which has since dissipated.
So in the sense, to make it specific, I mean, you took an early decision, which was obviously a very newsworthy one, to disengage Anna Netrebko, who really had been your prima donna, I guess, for the last 20 years. So that was a big decision in terms of your public.
She was our biggest star.
Mm-hmm. So again, and I know she's suing you still?
Yes.
Yeah. So you have stuck to your guns on that. But as you say, most of the other Berlin, Vienna, Paris, Milan, and so on, now London and Zurich as well, have re-engaged her and have justified publicly on the basis that she hasn't been back to Russia and that she denounced the war, but hasn't denounced Putin personally. But you obviously took the view there was a kind of a red line on Netrebko that you felt was just unacceptable.
Well, I mean, there's a reason why Ukraine considers her to be one of their enemies. She, in spite of whatever statements she's made, which have been conflicting statements, in my opinion, I'm saying in my opinion because that'll make my lawyers happy, she has been very closely associated with Putin for years. I mean, she may not be as active politically for Putin the way, say, Valery Gergiev was, but she was actually one of the people who nominated him for one of his presidencies. She wrapped herself in a separatist flag in Donetsk shortly after the invasion. I mean, or before the invasion, sorry. She has a track record of. I still remember in 2012 when I didn't understand where she was coming from, and I said to her sympathetically, "I was so sorry to hear that Pussy Riot has been put in jail," and she said, "That's where they belong." So, I mean, I sort of understood where she was coming from, but the main point is not Anna Netrebko. The main point is that the world needs to defend Ukraine, and I feel that it's very important that through the actions that the Met has taken, that we have helped Ukraine somewhat. And we can't physically fight for them, but we have made it possible for Ukrainian art in the form of its musical art to be exposed through performances of the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra by commissioning new works. We've commissioned an opera called The Mothers of Kherson, which is going to have its premiere in Warsaw next October, and then later on at the Met the following season, which is based on the true story of these very brave mothers who try to rescue their abducted children shortly after the invasion, when it became clear the Russians were kidnapping children. And in the case of the Mothers of Kherson, Kherson was one of the occupied cities early in the invasion, and the mothers who were left alone by their husbands were all fighting on the front lines. And so the mothers, fearing for their children's lives, agreed to, worrying that their teenage daughters would be raped by Russian soldiers, agreed to this false invitation, which they didn't realize was false, of course, at the time, to allow their kids to go to Crimea to a summer camp. And when they didn't return, it became obvious that they had been kidnapped. And at the time, shortly after that, the International Court accused Putin and Belova Lvova, I can never get her name right, who was the
Commissioner for Children, is she?
Commissioner for Children, or Commissioner of Abductions of Children. And she held a press conference after they were accused of war crimes in which she disingenuously invited any Ukrainian mother who felt that their child was wrongly being held in Russian-occupied territory to come and get them, which was a rather hollow invitation. But thanks to a couple of organizations in Ukraine, one was called Save Ukraine, a number of mothers actually went on this heroic journey in which they had to travel across Ukraine into Poland, to Belarus, into Russia, and then confront the authorities in these camps if they were able to find their children and try to rescue them. And some actually succeeded. So our opera is about that.
And you proposed that to the First Lady of Ukraine, Elena Zelenska.
Well, we talked with the First Lady, the first, Elena Zelenska is very, she's very much involved in the kind of soft, cultural power of Ukraine, trying to get the word out about, Ukrainian art and culture. Because part of Putin's plan is to stamp out not just Ukraine, but deny that it has any cultural legacy whatsoever. So, what we're trying to do is fight on the cultural front to combat that.
And as you say, on the one hand, Putin has weaponized Russian culture, Russian language, Russian literature. On the other hand, and I guess many curators and programmers in the House today, particularly those working in, for example, music, but across all art forms, have to make individual decisions about what kind of Russian art, if any, to program or not program. And as you say, you've taken a very strong position on certain Russian artists, but in terms of Russian repertoire, like Tchaikovsky, you have co-productions coming up, I think, on Khovanshina, Mussorgsky, Maid of Orleans. So you take a different view in terms of that kind of classic repertoire by...
Well, we're thousands of miles away from Ukraine. Ukraine has taken the position that you can't speak Russian in Ukraine, and you can't produce any Russian art. And I understand that they're in a dire black and white situation. Our position is that the great composers of the past, like Shostakovich, who himself was in constant danger his whole life from Stalin, that the great composers of the past should not be held hostage by Putin's actions.
So as you say, each, depending on your geography, on your position, each institution has to make its own decision on these dilemmas.
Right. I think the important thing, though, is to be consistent and to know why you're doing something and to stay true to it. And what the concern I have is institutions that waffle back and forth.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, Peter, so let's go out to the House. We have a couple of standing mics here. There's a couple of colleagues with roving mics also. We might maybe bring the House lights up at 10 or 20% if possible to see you all. Now, because we've less than 10 minutes left, what I would suggest would be wonderful to fit in as many comments as we can, just a brief comment or a brief question, rather than an extended contribution if possible. But that said, let's get going. Would people like to come down to the standing mics if you like, or if you're in the middle of a row, raise your hand and we'll try and reach you with a mic. We'll take maybe a few comments or questions together. Would anyone like to kick off? Okay, while we're just waiting for, I'm just trying to catch my eye here. If there's anyone might like to share again how you've grappled with a similar dilemma, or a kind of an organizational resilience dilemma. Can I just say, yes, now there's Anthony Sargent in the middle bang in the middle of the row, so I think a mic's going to come into you, Anthony, there. Super.
It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you both so much. Peter, I'm interested in your position is very clear and very principled, and you haven't perfectly properly. You haven't made any judgments about other opera houses in the world. But I wonder, is there any wider network in international opera houses? These issues like how you deal with Russia, how you deal with the great geopolitical challenges and problems of the day. Are you in those sort of discussions with other opera houses, or do you feel the Met's destiny is to do what it thinks is right, and that's the beginning and end of the story?
Well, I wouldn't be so arrogant as to say that. I am in dialogue with opera companies all the time. Mostly it's about programming. But we all face different types of issues. The Met's financial challenges are unique in the sense that we're the only kind of the big companies, we're the only one that has zero government support. In England, you have the Royal Opera, which is kind of a hybrid model, which has some government support. In Germany, the biggest opera houses have absolute government support still. Although, I think that it's, we don't really talk about, we talk about the financial aspects of sharing co-productions, but we don't talk about our respective problems because we all know we have our own problems to deal with, and they have to be dealt with in different ways. I mean, I suppose if we could form a a committee of triple-digit billionaires who would like to spread their wealth around to the opera companies, that would be a good thing to work on together. As far as our policies, dealing with Russia, I mean, there's not much to talk about because I really don't go around criticizing my colleagues. I guess I did a little bit before, but everyone has to deal with the reality on the ground and the way they feel they need to deal with it. But we're certainly we don't view ourselves as an island.
Thank you, Anthony. It does sound like you're a bit disappointed that some of the other major houses didn't hold the line or continue to hold the line on
Well, I just think, I think there's a certain naivete, that takes place. I mean, and I think Russia is really, is trying its best to undermine, the situation. I know that, for example, the Salzburg Festival is obviously funded by Russian money, and I don't think that I'm critical of. I think that's a terrible thing.
You still hear a lot of Russian in the streets of Salzburg, certainly. Now we have Torben here. Did I see someone in the middle at the back? Yes. So we'll take Torben Dittis here, and then there's a lady in the middle of that row, the second last row, and we'll maybe take them together and go back to Peter. Torben.
Hi, Peter. Torben from the Philharmonia Orchestra in London. Fascinating to hear your thoughts. While your personal view on both the Russian situation and also, taking funds from the Middle East is very clear, I think, to everyone who heard it here. Did you face any internal challenges by communicating and choosing this view, like from your staff, from your board, and how did you handle those?
Thanks, Torben.
I should.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. Interestingly, I mean, I try when I'm doing, if the Met is taking an action that is going to be controversial or difficult, I try to get some consensus beforehand. In fact, when we announced our Saudi deal, the union that represents all the singers at the Met, AGMA, actually made a statement supporting it. With the board, the board is generally in support of. I mean, I can't say every single. We have. The thing about nonprofits in America is we have very large boards, and the reason why we have such large boards is because it's a financial reason. Because we want as large a board as possible, because our board members are also our donors, and the way the Met is set up is there is a nucleus of an executive committee, then there is the managing directors there are about 40 of them who are who actually have governance and fiduciary responsibility for the institution, and then there are other much larger groups of boards. Within those groups, I'm sure I know there are some people who do not agree with everything I'm doing, certainly, but the directors who actually have governance and fiscal responsibility do support what we're doing, and I'm very careful to not do. One of the things I've learned over the years is you don't take actions without making sure people know what you're doing ahead of time.
Thanks, Torben. Thanks for that. Now, the lady, is that Tisa?
Hi, this is Tisa. Yes, it is. Hi, Eugene. It's Tisa Ho from Hong Kong. One of the things that we have been concerned about, and many of us are in the not-profit sector, and therefore reliant on either funders or donors or philanthropists. And when the proportion that they're responsible for, the proportion of the budget that they're responsible for gets large, some of us, I feel, there's a risk that they can influence artistic decisions. It's something that I think most of us want to resist. And as the budgets get rebalanced in this way, what do you see as the risk, Peter? And have you had any experience of pushback or you pushing back?
Well, thank you. When I first came to the Met, there had been a history of conceding or having artistic decisions made that were influenced very much by individual donors. And I made it clear when I came to the Met that practice could not go on. I mean, on the one hand, I go to donors all the time with our artistic plans and ask for their support. And I'm certainly happy to hear their comments and questions and answer them. But we don't operate. We've been very resistant and will continue to be forever, at least as long as I'm there, to not allow donors to decide what we should be doing artistically. I think it's very, it's this classic separation of church and state that I think a healthy organization has to maintain.
Was that famously Sybil Harrington, who used to always support all the Zeffirelli productions? Or?
Well, she was before my time there. I think, I don't know exactly who did what with whom, but I do know that I remember saying to the managing directors when I first arrived that that I didn't, that from a financial point of view, obviously I had to report to them. From an artistic point of view, they had to, not they didn't have to, but that I had to be, that I was going to follow what I felt, and working with my colleagues in my administration, what the right course was, and that their way of expressing their displeasure would be to fire me.
And 20 years later, Tisa, thanks for that.
Never, it could always happen.
We're coming literally just to the end of our time. Peter, I mean, a number of the big beasts running these great artistic institutions in New York, Jane Moss at Lincoln Center, Joe Melillo at BAM, Andre at the Lincoln Center Theatre, have retired, have moved on. But you're still obviously firmly on the captain on deck. What really fires you up now 20 years in? What keeps the fire and the passion for?
Well, I think I want to find the solution. I would like to leave the Met knowing that we finally figured it out how to make art and commerce work.
And do you feel you're getting closer?
I feel we're continuing to work at it.
I think your lawyers would be very happy with that answer. Peter,
it's a true answer.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being so open, so forthcoming with us this afternoon. And ladies and gentlemen, Peter Gelb.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eugene.
Thanks, Peter.